Welcome everybody to this final chapter of Purple Haze feedback. I am not really sure what to call it. I guess an afterword of sorts, both mine and the original authors as well. Let's jump straight into the video because we have very many things to talk about. And I guess to provide a table of contents of sorts, we'll start off with the chapter analysis of the previous chapter, which we didn't get to do because I was busy saying thank you, and I didn't want that to be bogged down by me discussing how, Giorno is talking about courage and how this contrasts Kokaki's use of the word courage and stuff like that, which I will be doing in this episode, so get excited for that. And then after that, we will be doing the review of Purple Haze feedback that I've been talking about for a while now. And it's not so much a review as it is a retrospective of the whole book, rather than back in chapter 8 I did a retrospective just of the first half of the book. I guess review is kind of a bad word because I'm not gonna give it a score or anything. This is just a summary of my thoughts on the book, all kind of grouped together for convenience. After that, you'll also get my thoughts on my own audiobook adaptation. Obviously, as the creator of the audiobook, I have some thoughts and comments on my work, and this is my opportunity to share that with you guys, to kind of self-critique, and maybe you guys can comment your own critiques in the comment section below, and we can kind of toss around ideas for future audiobooks as well. And then finally, we'll get to the author's afterword. And if you're just interested in that, then there'll be a timestamp in the description just to that little bit. And in fact, all of these other parts that I've been talking about will also have their own timestamp. So if you're more interested just in what I have to say about Purple Haze feedback, rather than the analysis of the chapter, then you can skip ahead to that as well. And then that will be the end of Purple Haze feedback, which will be a weight off my shoulders, no doubt, but also kind of sad because this has meant so much to me for the past half year. I've devoted a lot of care and attention to it, and to create this, to share it with you guys, has meant a lot to me. So I just wanted to say thank you once again for sharing that journey with me. Let's get straight into the first part of the video, and that is the chapter analysis. I've got quite a few things to talk about. In fact, this whole video, it might be like an hour long at least, because most of my notes, right, for every chapter analysis, I have like a set of notes, which are about 5 to 10 lines long on Notepad, and they're all about a sentence. And you know, those take from 5 to 10 to 15 minutes to fully enunciate, right, to get those thoughts out onto the recording. My set of notes for this video is 75 lines. I'll try and keep my points brief, and I'll try not to get onto too many tangents, but this could, I'm not lying, this could take like 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on the length of the video. You might want to get some water, you might want to get some popcorn, or of course you can skip some of the sections. So, the chapter analysis. The chapter starts immediately after the preceding one. In fact, there isn't even a chapter split in the original text. I introduced that myself, I wanted Volpe's death to be its own end. And so I ended episode 12 of the audiobook with that, with Volpe's death. And so the very beginning of this chapter is Shida E realizing that Fugo isn't dying to Purple Haze. And we learned that Purple Haze has evolved into a different stand. And because of that, even though Fugo does use his own power against himself, he does not die. This brings up the contrast with Sale and Zucchero and Vittorio, who died because of their own stands. Fugo, on the other hand, doesn't die, despite using his own stand against himself. That contrast is once again exacerbated, which I've already talked about previously, but I just wanted to complete that thought, because without knowing whether Fugo survived, which I didn't make clear at the end of the previous chapter, there's nothing on which we can base that argument. Purple Haze Distortion is the name of the newsstand, which has confused me quite a lot in the past because the book is called Purple Haze Feedback, and I'll get them confused from time to time, and I might do it in this video as well, so apologies in advance. I'm not really sure what it's referencing. Purple Haze is the name of the Jimi Hendrix song. Distortion is just, I don't know what that's referencing. Maybe it's just the fact that Jimi uses a lot of distortion. I don't know. But yeah, so Distortion doesn't really have any physical evolution so far as I can see. The way that Gold Experience Requiem had that, the way its head kind of flowered out. Purple Haze Distortion doesn't necessarily have that, but it has changed in the nature of its power. Mainly, the virus that Purple Haze is host to, if we can call it that, is now so dangerous that it will literally kill itself, right? Other members of the same virus. It will attack other members of that cell and they will wipe each other out. And so in the stand description, it actually clarifies that if Fugo wants to kill enemies, he can't go all out. He can't just say, this is my virus and you will take the full brunt of this. He will actually need to temper the efficacy of his virus. And that's, a very clear metaphor to how he needs to cool his rage that he feels against his enemies, to not be driven by anger all the time. That being said, it's not like the virus has been made any weaker, because it still only took a matter of seconds for Volpe to dissolve, right? He didn't even have time to think, to regret, which we talked about in the previous chapter as well. So it's not like Fugo has been underpowered now. It's just mentally, he's got a different ball game going on in there, and he needs to think about the nature of his stand in a different way. As do we, obviously. This is one of the few moments in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure where stands are the center of character development. And I really like it when this happens, where not only does the character grow as a human being, that specifically happens in JoJo all the time, but it's cool to see that stands are the center, the focus of that development. I did a video on this which you can find on my channel, but in it I list examples like Echo's turning from Act 1 to Act 2 to Act 3, as well as Trish, her development as a character is reflected by the appearance of her stand, and how she chooses to use it and for what reasons. So if you're interested in the idea, I recommend checking out the video because I'm quite proud of it and I think it does a good job of explaining the idea. Self-promotion, yay! But moreover, it's really cool to see that in works that aren't written by Araki. It really shows that the idea of stands is very intuitive in a lot of ways. It doesn't really need to be broken down in order to be built and seen from different perspectives. That's one of the reasons why I really like stands, and I'm glad that fiction not written by Araki gets that so immediately. So we get into the restaurant scene, and wow, wasn't this a great scene? I thought it was at any rate. There's so many emotional touchstones for us to relate to Fugo, and every time we come across one, and every time Fugo develops more through larger increments as he talks with Giorno, and Giorno, is really very generous to Fugo, basically. There's this feeling that Fugo has finally been liberated from something that has been troubling him greatly over the past 6 months, and now he's finally coming to the end of it with the help of Giorno. And it really makes you appreciate both Fugo and Giorno that much more. And they both feel like very well-written characters, which is something I've discussed in the past with my halfway retrospective, and I'll talk about it more with my upcoming review. But yeah, this was a fantastic conversation. One of the things that I thought it did really well was bridging Part 5 and Purple Haze Feedback. This did a lot more for making Purple Haze Feedback feel like an after-story to Vento Oreo than, for example, giving Pericolo a backstory. It just felt clunky and awkward, but here it actually feels the subtle references to a lot of things, like Giorno's past in Japan. It really feels like this is the Giorno that we remember from Vento Oreo and not just a Dio clone, which is what I've talked about previously. Also, he's called Jojo for the first time in all of anything ever, and now to be called Jojo in the after story, after he's established himself as the boss, was a really, really good touch. It felt like you were waiting for something, but you didn't even know that you were. And yet, when he finally says, yeah, call me Jojo, it's like, oh yes, we never called him Jojo. And this is finally the time where he kind of comes into his own as a Jojo. If Vento Oreo ever gets animated, I think this is one of the reasons why Purple Haze Feedback should be tied to that project, either as an OVA or as part of the TV release, which would be pretty wild. I think this is one of the strongest reasons why Purple Haze Feedback should be animated, because, well, we get to hear Giorno become a Jojo. Moreover, we also get references to Fugo's point that they never even knew what music Trish liked, which is of course brought up when we hear Trish singing. Is that ever mentioned in the manga, that Trish used to go around singing with her mother at different locales? I don't think Trish is ever mentioned to be like a singer or a performer in any way. It does describe why she has such expensive tastes. She is a star in her own right, and so it is a bit more natural for her to be spoilt when we first see her in Vento Oreo. Nonetheless, I think, that entire radio interview between Trish and the other guy was another very touching moment, both for Fugo as well as to reflect Trish's development. Her words that without her friends she wouldn't have gotten to where she was today are absolutely true. She would probably be dead, if anything. It's just nice to see the perspective of a character that we know from Part 5 but we didn't get enough of an involvement with, to see things from their perspective wholly. And on top of that, it was nice to see that resolution from Fugo's perspective of Trish's character, of her nature, and of course of the music that she likes. Speaking of which, she sings a traditional Italian song called O Soldata Innamorata, which means the soldier in love, and in order to find a woman singing this song, I had to troll through the internet for like an hour at least, and one of the challenges was all the women singing it all made it sound very sad, or else it had shit audio quality. And by complete luck, I managed to find the cover that I did by a YouTube channel called Jimi. Boy, am I grateful that I found an interpretation of the song by a woman that actually reflected the content of the writing. Because if I didn't, I would be in deep, deep trouble. What would I do then? Find a karaoke and try and sing it myself? Oh, that would have been painful to listen to. But I'm really glad I found this, and I commented it in the previous video as well. But if you haven't done so already, can I just ask anyone listening to go to that video, go to Jenny's cover of O Soldata Namurata, and give it a like, maybe comment, you know, the classic memeerkat sent me here, or whatever thing that you... Actually, don't do that. You know, just give it a like, and that would be a nice way to support that artist, because they gave me something that I could never have done by myself, a part of the audiobook that was troubling me for a while, and to find it at such great quality was a blessing. It really was. So please just like give it a like. That's all I'm asking. Anyway, let's return to the restaurant scene. There's also reference to Trish's adventures, and she says she goes to Naples and Venice and Rome and all these other places. But in the original text, they actually put in Sardinia, which I thought was weird. Didn't Trish grow up in Sardinia? Kind of odd to say that you went to visit Sardinia when that's where you've been living your entire life. Or maybe she did not in fact live in Sardinia. Leave a comment answering that, because honestly, I'm a bit confused. And also they mentioned Notorious B.I.G. Now, in chapter 12, I did give a theory that Nightbird Flying was not alive because of Volpe's stand, but was instead alive just because of Angelica's desire to see Fugo die. The stand has escaped, so to speak, from the body that was holding it back, and all that's left is her will to kill Fugo. And so to reference Notorious B.I.G. in this chapter, immediately after seeing Nightbird Flying fly away, even after Volpe's death, I think gives a lot more credence to that theory, rather than Sheila E.'s thought, which was Volpe was keeping Angelica alive somehow. But in the context of the dialogue between Giorno and Fugo, Giorno references Notorious B.I.G. to better describe why Giorno was so afraid of Purple Haze, because if Fugo were to die, which is very possible because of the nature of the stand, then there's nothing that is holding Purple Haze from just going on this rampage of pure rage and anger. Those are the emotions that Fugo channels into Purple Haze in order to better use it. And as we've talked about already, one of the reasons why Purple Haze turned into Purple Haze Distortion is because he no longer completely relies on an anger or rage that the rest of society doesn't follow what he believes, as Giorno mentions later on. Instead, it's about what can I share with other people, what do I want to protect. Generally a better state of mind than Fugo's previous attitude, which was just always hating everything and killing it and destroying it if you don't like it. Which was what he channeled into Purple Haze. And to think of Purple Haze as something like Notorious B.I.G., where that hatred can be channeled even after Fugo's death, is indeed kind of terrifying. But I think it also introduces a new idea to a stand, which is, regardless of the power of the stand, it can still continue to exist even after the death of the original user. So I guess that actually says something interesting about Notorious B.I.G., which some fans have noted previously, and it's that the power isn't activated when Notorious B.I.G. dies, which would be kind of stupid because he can only use the stand power once ever. Instead, it's more Notorious B.I.G. realized that he couldn't take on all of these people all at once, so instead of limiting his power to his own capabilities against 6 very talented and trained stand users, he would just give it free rein, driven by the hate and the pain that he felt as he died being shot by Mister's bullets. That paints Notorious B.I.G. as a much more tragic character than he was originally written as. And I actually like this theory a lot. So that's my new headcanon regarding Notorious B.I.G. actually. But we're going off on a deep tangent here, so let's just stop that there and move on to mainly the thematic underpinnings, shall we say, of Fugo's adventure. Giorno points out that Fugo sees everything as a conflict between his nature as a human being and his understanding of the world. Even though they should be in alignment, they're actually deeply in conflict. His nature is very emotive. He sees things from a very emotionally driven way. But his understanding of the world is that in order to move forward, you have to give yourself to what society thinks you should be doing, which is, of course, why he left Bruno's gang, because he thought that that's what Passione, being a member of Passione, is about. You have to give yourself over completely to Passione, and it's not about what your emotions say regarding the matter. It doesn't matter if you want to be with Bucciolati. It's about you've tied yourself to Passione is his argument against going with Bucciolati. Even though he desperately wants to go with Bucciolati, he can't find the courage to break away from Passione. And of course that word courage is brought up over and over again throughout the text. In its earliest significant iteration by Kokaki, who, he describes his point of view as very Sicilian. He says that it doesn't matter what you feel. It doesn't matter what's right or what's wrong. All that matters is living quietly and suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as Shakespeare would say, through silence and forbearance are, I think, the two words he uses. Giorno is saying that you need to have the courage to fight against things that you don't believe in personally, even if everyone else does, which is basically how Giorno started his fight against Diavolo and drugs and Passione and became the boss. So it's appropriate for Giorno to be teaching this lesson, is what I'm trying to say. But Giorno doesn't say that this is the right way that courage should be used. Instead, he says that everyone must find their own definition of courage. So he actually validates both Kokaki's and Fugo's interpretation of courage. And this isn't too satisfactory. I wish that he could have just said, yep, there's a right way to courage, because that would have given us a bit more of an idea on Giorno's character and what he deems to be important. But instead he says something that's kind of just very generically true, and that's that everyone must find their own definition of courage and everyone must walk towards it, however painful that process may be. And all of this is kind of the focus of the afterword. Although it is a bit rambly, which I appreciate that I am also being a bit rambly, but in the afterword he also talks about stuff like this. And hopefully the point that Giorno and I am trying to get across will be more evident by then. We're still not done with the chapter analysis, yay! Okay, so something briefly that I noticed was a motif of believing in others and having faith. Giorno says that he had faith in Fugo to do the right things, which is weird for Giorno to say because he has Gold Experience Requiem, the most overpowered stand, and yet, he still needed to believe in Fugo's ability to do that himself, and he couldn't rely entirely on his power alone. This furthers the thematic conflict that we were talking about previously, which was Fugo and his nature as a human being versus Fugo and his place in the world. To believe in others and to have faith in others, the way that Bruno had faith in Giorno, the way Fugo had faith in Bruno, means that you can't live without other people. You can't live outside of society. You can't be your own person all the time. But unlike Fugo and unlike Kokaki, you can't live completely immersed within it. You can't live without fighting it to some degree, and you can't live dependent on it. And in some ways, we get a reflection of Fugo's words back at San Giorgio Maggiore. You can't live outside the mob. Those were the words he said. But of course now, Fugo would say, can you live by having faith in those that you love, perhaps? And finally, at the end of all this thematic stuff, we get a mention of Sheila E. as a foil to Fugo. How she places too much faith in Giorno, and she's too quick to punish herself for her wrongs. She's completely driven by herself as opposed to her place in society. Recall that she joined Passione to kill someone in Passione, right? So Passione means nothing to her. It's more of a means to an end. When she was tasked with killing the narcotics squad, it was because Giorno felt so strongly about drugs. And Giorno, of course, is someone that she places a lot of faith in, someone she follows very dearly. And so pretty much every character is somewhere in that spectrum of living for your own sake versus living for the sake of society. Morello started at one end and slowly, after meeting Giorno, starts going to the other end. Sheila E is specifically mentioned as an opposite to Fugo, and Giorno wanted Sheila E to learn a lesson from her opposite. Sometimes the desires of the self aren't as significant as servicing a greater goal. Anyway, so we get to the very end of the chapter. Fugo gets his last bit of character development, which I think is very beautiful, and it's letting go of his regret and his shame about leaving Bucciolati's team, which was driven by the previous thematic point, of course, the self versus society, but also now that he's come to understand why he had done it and fully has to wrestle with his regret of not doing what he wanted to do at the time. Now he has to let go of that after immediately being fully exposed to it, and it's a very, this is the part that really drives home how much Fugo has changed, and it's a very tragic moment for the character who finally realizes, I messed up. It is very much heartbreaking. It was one of those moments where Giorno's empathetical qualities really made themselves obvious in what he says to Fugo about taking half a step, and he will share the grief with him. And then we get to the end of the chapter and the end of the chapter analysis. Let's take a look at the Purple Haze feedback review that I've been talking about. This I want to be kind of a sequel to the halfway retrospective, so I'll talk about stuff that I talked about there, and then also talk about some of the stronger parts and the weaker parts of the text as a whole. So the first really important point from the halfway retrospective that I wanted to talk about was Giorno. We were speaking of Giorno just before. In this last chapter, Giorno was mentioned as a mix of light and dark, which, well, you know, that's obviously a reference to how he's both Jonathan and Dio's son at the same time. And I think this is a much better representation of what Giorno should have been from the start, instead of just a Dio clone as he was shown to be previously. But in hindsight, I think that the chapter of Giorno reading that book in the darkness was meant to be kind of a red herring. The idea that maybe Giorno has fallen to the temptation of power and has turned into a very Dio-like figure. But this, you know, I didn't really feel that was made explicit in any way, and instead it was just meant to be a moment where he evokes Dio and evokes Dio's charisma and mannerisms without any real payoff. And so I still dislike that previous scene that had Giorno, but this scene, I think, showed a lot of his charisma, the ability to make other people trust him very easily, but also showed a lot of Jonathan's kindness. His desire to help everyone and to fight evil is very Jonathan-like, and I think this chapter specifically did a great job of that. So that critique that I had in the halfway retrospective of Giorno being just a Dio XP has kind of faded away by this point. I still would say that it would be best if they just cut out that chapter, because it really added nothing, it really meant nothing at all, and it wildly misrepresented Giorno. I'm glad that has its own chapter because it's very skippable now. The other point about Giorno that I was moaning about in the halfway retrospective was Giorno as Bruno's savior, right? We get this big long spiel about how Giorno saved so many people, including Bruno, and Bruno was completely dependent on Giorno throughout the journey, which was obviously not true. But more than that, we also got claims that Mr. and Sheila E. were saved by Giorno. Mr., it's never explained why he feels that way, and Sheila E. explains that she feels that way because Giorno killed Illuso, which is not true. Fugo killed Illuso. But in the last chapter, Giorno is better described as someone that Bruno entrusted his future, his hopes, his dreams, and his fate to. And I think that's a much better description of what's going on in part 5, rather than saying that Giorno is Bruno's savior, to think of him as someone that Bruno trusted after Bruno's death, or impending death rather, after Bruno turns into a zombie, someone that Bruno hoped would carry the torch to see Diavolo's reign of evil end. Even though the general concept was the same, I feel the way it was written, the specific words that were used, I think that's a much more meaningful way of writing it, rather than Mr. or Sheila E. just saying that Giorno was the one that saved them and made their lives meaningful or whatever, you know, like that's really hamming it up, I think. Whereas this is a bit more subtle and a bit more nuanced, and also just describes Bruno's character in a better way. The other significant point that I wanted to talk about was all these weird, irrelevant backstories that kept propping up. Like, we talked about Pericolo, who didn't need a backstory. We talked about the assassination squad that didn't need a backstory, but they got one because Morolo needed a backstory, and so he just kind of got thrown in there. But the really weird thing is, we actually found an example of someone who didn't need a backstory getting a backstory, and it actually worked out brilliantly, and that was Tonio Trussardi. His presence deepens Massimo Volpe's nature as someone very lethargic, someone who didn't care about society at all. We see that part of Volpe's nature, and it also deepens the thematic conflict of the book, the self versus society thing that we've been talking way too much about now. But also we get some insight on Volpe's father, as well as Tonio's father, I guess, who characterizes Fugo in some ways, even though he dislikes society and he'll shun it and he'll insult it. He has no response to it other than to bow down to it, and he'll express his dissatisfaction, but he won't fight against it. And so that's very Fugo-like in some ways. And similarly, Tonio, who has this dream of being a chef and making people happy with his cooking, that dream very much parallels Giorno, who in this last chapter also says, I have a dream, which was a great way to tie part 5 with Purple Haze feedback once more. Also, Tonio, who's always so positive and cheerful, in part 4 we see that in a new light. We understand the struggles that he had to face, and contrasted against Volpe's nature, we see Tonio as someone who achieved a wholesomeness rather than someone who just had that his entire life. And also, you know, this is kind of not necessary, but it also explains how he got his stand without a stand arrow, which was lacking in part 4, which up until that point was entirely about people who got their stands through the stand arrow. Yeah, I think Tonio was one of the weird things that actually worked in Purple Haze feedback. That was a reference to events of the manga, and moreover, an event from part 4, not even part 5, so just like a weird detail overall. I think those are the big points from the halfway retrospective that I had major complaints about, and it's kind of interesting how the second half of the text managed to fix exactly those issues that I had. kind of scary, but I think, these were strong issues that the author probably himself noticed with the first half of the book, and it's nice to see them being completely addressed, changed, modified to be a much more interesting read. So let's get into some quick little discussion on what I thought were the strongest parts of the text and the weakest parts of the text. Now that I'm calling it a review, I might as well have some review-like elements in the video. Strongest parts definitely are Foucault's developments from someone who's driven by guilt and rage to someone who learns to empathize with others and share his guilt. That journey, specifically with reference to stuff we saw in Vento Oreo, as well as stuff we didn't see in Vento Oreo that referenced his past as a member of Bruno's team, I thought these were the strongest parts of the text. Seeing more of Foucault's past and the development of Bruno's team, and all these references to events before Vento Oreo were some of the strongest parts of Purple Haze feedback. Another really strong element from the text was the narcotics team. Just everything about them I thought was fantastic. From their point of view, of course, the text reads as a tragedy in some ways, for reasons that I've talked about previously, such as, Volpe finding love and purpose in Angelica, and then that was tragically taken away from him. And that, I think, speaks for itself in some ways, the degree to which the narcotics team aren't just villains, but also characters in their own rights. Another great part of Purple Haze feedback was the Sicilian setting. Sicily itself, I thought, was very well explored. It really kind of felt like we'd gone on a big tourist trip through Sicily, and we'd seen a bunch of the really cool sites there, such as like the amphitheater, and of course the Temple of Apollo at Ortigia. Ortigia itself, as far as I understand, being a tourist hub. So, that felt really cool to experience. We also spent a lot more time there than any of the other settings. So for example, when we're in Venice in part 5, it doesn't really feel like we're going around looking at a bunch of different places. Everything's so focused on the plot. Immediately, as soon as we get there, we have to get to San Giorgio Maggiore, and from there we have to get out of there immediately to the airport because we're being chased by a bunch of other stands. Here in Purple Haze feedback, it really feels like Sicily is the main venue, and we really get to spend a lot of time there. It really made Sicily feel a lot more complete than any of the other settings that we saw in part 5. Speaking of part 5, I thought Purple Haze feedback, and I think this is the most consistent praise for Purple Haze feedback, it does a fantastic job of expanding the events at the end of part 5, which is very sadly lacking. Like, there is a single page. Vento Oreo basically ends on a single page. We have one page where we see Giorno become the boss, and that's it, that's the end, and it's like, what? That can't be it. There's got to be more. And that's where Purple Haze feedback steps in. It does a fantastic job on that end, at least. As for the weaker parts of the text, I thought the supporting characters lacked development, ironically. The villains were good characters, but the secondary characters weren't. I feel like both Sheila E. and Marolo could have gotten a lot more development, could have been much more significant characters, and could have driven Fugo to a much stronger emotional resolution by themselves if the author had written it like that. And in that case, Giorno kind of wouldn't have been relevant at all. That was not the case. Instead, we got kind of middling secondary characters, and they didn't really drive any of the character drama of the work, which is a shame. Also, the quality of the writing wildly fluctuated, and it's hard to tell whether this was just the translation. Some of the translation does seem a bit awkward, or maybe the translation itself just hadn't been edited at the time. But sometimes you can tell that it was the author's fault, like that line that I mentioned about jet engines being attached to legs. Just very out of place and awkward writing, difficult to read, difficult to take seriously as well. The stands I thought weren't that great either, although this can be a bit more of a personal preference thing. I thought, for example, that Angelica's stand and Kokaki's stand were a bit too similar to merit being completely different stands. I thought Massimo's stand didn't have a power that was very well defined. It was just kind of make drugs, but there wasn't any great description of what the drug was, and so it doesn't really make that much sense when he injects the drugs into himself and he turns into a superhuman. It seems kind of like an ass-pull, but whatever, it's JoJo, so it's not that big of a deal. There's other stands that I felt didn't have a great time to shine. After we learned that Marolo's stand is an assassination stand rather than just a fortune-telling stand, we never see it ever again, and that's kind of a shame. And Sheila E's Voodoo Child really didn't get any fights at all. And speaking of the fights, again, I thought they were not as good as they could have been. Way not up to JoJo's scratch, I can say that much, but I think for the scope of the story, it was good enough. And especially since it is a novel, it's hard to be so detailed on the physical matters of the fight, and so a lot of the fights center around the dialogues and the thoughts that occur as the characters fight, which is good for the kind of character development centric story that the author is trying to tell. But in terms of the action that we see and we usually associate with JoJo, I thought it was lacking. Although, like I said, the nature of the text as a light novel reduces the capacity to communicate the physicality of the fight. If that made sense. If not, then whatever. The fights were decent. I'll say that much. Finally, this is actually not about the text, but instead about the illustrations. So this is actually on Araki's end. I thought the illustrations seemed kind of out of place. You know, we have Sheila E., who's this 14-year-old girl, and she has got scars on her face, and she's very serious, but she's dressed like a gypsy dancer. I don't know how to describe it. It looks very odd and out of place. Similarly, Massimo Volpe looks way too fly to be this psychopathic drugs dealer that he's portrayed as in the text. And also, Murolo's hat is completely wrong. What's the deal with that? Did Araki not know what a Borsellino hat is? Whatever. The point is, the illustration seemed out of place, and I've obviously, complained multiple times about how Purple Haze's virus remains unillustrated for the rest of the text. But I did end up finding some illustrations online, which I shamelessly stole for chapter 12, and it's on the video if you want to see Angelica dying to Purple Haze for whatever reason. So, in conclusion, what can I say? I think Purple Haze Feedback is a great text that has some interesting additions to the Mentor Oreo story. I think it's not a particularly good read, but as far as JoJo light novels go, I can say that it's probably the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure light novel that best captures what it would be like if JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was written instead of drawn, if Araki had become a writer instead of a mangaka. That being said, I haven't read Fourth Another Day, which as far as I understand is also equally good if not better. But the difference there is that this is for part 5, which had a terrible ending and completely ignored Fugo after he left, and those two loose ends are significant enough that they necessitated being followed through, and Purple Haze Feedback does that very, very well. So if you want a sentence that summarizes my thoughts, if you're just here because you saw the word review and you thought, give me an opinion, then this is my opinion. If you have read part 5, you must read Purple Haze Feedback. That's my sentence. I don't think you should read it for its own merits, but I think that it does enough as a sequel to part 5 that it needs to be read if you have read part 5. But other than that, I think that any text that can mix references to classical Italian canzones alongside Jimi Hendrix songs has got to be some level of cool. And Purple Haze Feedback has that at the very least. Oh, so much talking. Okay, let's speed through to the end. We've only got a few more lines left. Firstly, the self-review of my own audiobook. I think it's decent. Okay, no, let me start from the very beginning. This was my first audiobook, and much was learnt. When I first released episode 1, the intent was to have one episode released per day. I thought that was feasible, and of course the first episode was chapter 0, which was kind of the prelude, and it was very short, and I thought having one released a day would be very, very easy, and my folly was realized when I released chapter 1, the second episode, which was like 20 minutes long, and then I realized I needed to do some voices, and then I realized I needed to do acting, and slowly I started giving even more voices to different characters. The depth of the acting became more prominent. Immediately I realized it was friggin' stupid to try and release one per day. Obviously, proof is in the pretty long delays that occurred over the course of the series, which was completely unintended. I did intend for at least like a weekly schedule, but that was not to be. Schedule-wise, I think I've got a better understanding of what exactly the scope of an audiobook should be and how long it should take to complete one episode. Audio-wise, I also learned a lot, both in the quality of my voice as well as the use of music. I felt the presence of music was mainly awkward for the entirety of the audiobook. Most audiobooks don't use music, but I did for this one to hide, pops and cracks and background noise from my voice recording, which you'll probably hear a lot of in this one because I don't think this will have music. But also it was to hide my lack of acting skills, because the music in each scene gave an emotional quality, right? Like if there's sad music playing, then obviously you'll know to be sad, and that was used to mask my acting, in my head at the very least. I'm sure some of you have commented that my acting is very good. I don't feel that way, and I think it's actually the music deceiving you to think that way. Because the music itself is sad, it doesn't matter how I act those words, they will seem to be sad. So yeah, that was my attitude regarding the music. For future audiobooks, I do intend to remove the music, so that will be a bit more of a challenge, but that should really speed up the process for stuff like Over Heaven, which is just like a diary that I don't think has any voices that I specifically need to change from. It's all just narration, as well as George Joestar, which is just a wild, wild ride. If I don't have music on those, then it should really speed up the process, and maybe with a reduction of acting, it will be more of a classical audiobook experience. Speaking of music, if there's one thing that I wish I'd done from the very start, it would be to use the Italian songs mentioned, like Avuchella, Me Voglio Fanacasa, Luna Nova, stuff like this. I wish I'd integrated into the text itself, rather than just have them be the background music to my end of chapter analysis. Also, I intended to use Pastime Paradise as the ending for each chapter, because Pastime Paradise is the original song that was sampled for Gangster's Paradise. Pastime Paradise by Stevie Wonder also has some lyrical content that I think really matches the spirit of the text. And Gangster's Paradise is well associated in the fandom as being the song for Vento Oreo, and I really, really hope that it is in fact used as the ending song for the Vento Oreo anime. Although the chances of that happening are rare, coupled with the chances of a Vento Oreo happening soon are already pretty low, unfortunately. So yeah, I wanted Pastime Paradise to be this motif that was constantly brought up and used throughout the audiobook. That was not to be, I just kind of got bored of the song, but also the end of chapter analyses that I did started getting really long after I improved drastically over the course of the audiobook, turning just from like, oh, I hope everyone enjoyed this, and this chapter was really fun to do, to actually like a thematic and critical evaluation of each chapter as it came out, and I'm really happy with that. And of course, clean versions without the analyses will be coming out soon, but specifically for this audiobook, I do need to fix a couple of things that were really messy with the early chapters, like sound quality, but also just the way it was edited, and the music was just not very well done in a couple of places. So yeah, those fixes will be made, and then it will probably come out as one giant video that's like 3 hours, 4 hours long. But yeah, speaking of that, actually, length also became an issue. I'd have these big episodes where I'd narrate an entire chapter from the audiobook all at once, and that would be like 25 minutes plus, and then on top of that I would add like a 10-minute analysis. And so suddenly these audiobook chapters that I wanted to come out daily were turning into these giant 35-minute things that were a real commitment to make, and no doubt a real commitment to listen to as well. So once again, I really appreciate the fact that a lot of you listened all the way through. And so something that I'm going to be doing for future audiobooks will be trimming down either my analyses or the length of each chapter by quite a significant amount, so that at most a single video will be like 20 to 25 minutes long, both for my sake and for yours, shorter chapters for future audiobooks. I think that's everything that I have to say about my own audiobook. Of course, I have more specific points with each end of chapter analyses. I did mention a couple of things that I disliked about each chapter and how I intended to improve them. But overall, as an audiobook, kind of looking back on everything that I've done, I think I did a pretty good job, but there's still a lot more that I want to improve on. And the best way to do that will, of course, be more audiobooks, which of course I intend to do. So let's get into that part of the video now. Future plans, what I intend to do now that the new year is here, now that we finished the audiobook, where this channel will intend to go. Firstly, as much as I've talked about future audiobooks, I actually intend to take a break from audiobooks. I do want all the JoJo light novels that have been translated to be adapted, and even if new translations come out, I do intend to adapt those as well. But the thing is, it's just really, I'm quite exhausted from reading Purple Haze feedback, and I kind of just want to take a break from these light novels. Not a long break, mind you, but enough that I feel energetic when I come back to it, rather than feeling a bit apprehensive, if I can call it that. Over Heaven and George Dosar should both be like a mad dash if I'm not using a lot of voices and if I'm not having a lot of music. Hopefully I'll have finished that by the first half of the year, and in the second half of the year, just as I did with Purple Haze feedback, I intend to finish Fourth Another Day. So by the end of 2018, we should have finished all of the light novels that are currently translated. So that's quite exciting. And I know George Joestar, someone mentioned this in the comments, I know that George Joestar is quite a long text actually. I just feel like it doesn't deserve the same amount of attention and care and detail as the Purple Haze feedback audiobook got, just because it's George Joestar, just because it is a wild ride, and to treat it as seriously as I have Purple Haze feedback feels like it goes against the spirit of the narrative. So yeah, George Joestar should be really unique as an audiobook, in that it might end up being more of like a let's play, or a let's read, I suppose would be the more appropriate term. Maybe I'll be a bit jokey about it, but I know for sure that I won't put as much effort into it as I did for Purple Haze feedback. Not because I don't think it deserves it, but because I just don't think it goes with the nature of the story. And I hope you guys are okay with that. If not, leave a comment. Of course, I am open to suggestions. In the meantime, I'm thinking of doing another Let's Play. I started this channel with a Prince of Persia Sands of Time Let's Play, and I did say that after finishing my audiobook, one episode per day, I would go back to doing a Let's Play of a different video game. But now, 6 months on, now that I've finally finished the Purple Haze feedback audiobook, maybe it's time now to pick up another video game and do a bit of a Let's Play analysis of that video game, just as I did for Sands of Time, although with a bit more production quality, now that I'm a bit more familiar with editing and YouTube and all that. For example, Hellblade is a game that I recently played, and I've got a lot to say about, so maybe that will be like the next big series that I do, a Let's Play of Hellblade, and then we'll get back into an audiobook, and then we'll kind of alternate. More definitively, I do intend to do more JoJo's Bizarre Adventure analyses. I released 2 over the course of 2017, and they were decently popular, I suppose, but I intend to do more. I've got this, basically around September, I wrote this giant thing about stand design. I recorded it, and it was like 2 hours long. It was this massive video, and I actually thought to myself, yeah, I'm gonna release this and it's gonna be fantastic. Obviously I never got around to it because it was a 2-hour video. Over the course of 2018, what I intend to do is to break that 2-hour video down to much smaller chunks, 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, and talk about each of the ideas that I developed, and release these short videos over the course of the next few months, and hopefully get some good discussion going about stand design as well. That is in the works, and hopefully I can release the first one by the end of January, but they should start coming out by February at the very least, if my schedule doesn't go completely off the rails like it did in 2017. The final thing that I want to introduce to the channel is shorter analysis videos on fan content, bigger analysis videos on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure itself, short discussions on doujins and fan art and stuff that you guys recommend. I already have an idea for the first one. It was recommended by one of you guys in the comment section below, called 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, and I think it's a good way to wrap up this Purple Haze saga that we've done, and also a good way to introduce a new series, and that's the analysis of fan content in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And it should be a nice, short but engaging discussion on how fan content is shaped by JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and how JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is conceived through the eyes of people other than Araki himself. Okay, it's time for the afterword. Wow, that took a fucking long time. I'm at like 2 hours of recording here. This will probably get trimmed down to maybe an hour, maybe less, depending on how attached I become to the words I've said. But yeah, we're going into the author's afterword. I don't really have much to say about the afterword, to be honest. It's a bit rambly, which I've said previously. I appreciate that I am the one saying this after making a huge rambly video myself. I think it does this interesting thing where it takes the themes that were explored in the text and kind of extrapolates them to real life scenarios, which is something that JoJo itself does quite a lot. Not specifically with regards to the themes, but instead just everything else, having biological facts suddenly become involved in the story somehow. Like there's a specific stand that shares biological traits with a fungus or something like that. That was in part 5. And of course there's the phenomenon of heavy weather, which uses subliminal messaging in order to turn people into snails. These kind of bizarre take on real life things that somehow feed into JoJo in weird ways. I think the author kind of does that, except with the themes of the text rather than just the stand powers. So that's interesting, I suppose. The background music, I'm not exactly sure why this is listed the way it is, but right at the very bottom of the afterword, as kind of a postscript, there's a line that says the background music to this is a Jimi Hendrix song called Machine Gun, which I actually couldn't find. I couldn't find a copy of it at all, at least not legally. But thanks to the magic of the internet, I did in fact manage to obtain a copy of it, and that will be the background music. Not to worry that I'm not making money from this content, so blah blah blah. Anyway, there's also a short verse at the end of the afterword, which speaks for itself. I'm not going to do an analysis of it. It is kind of awkwardly placed at the end of the text, but it's well written, and I think it does a pretty good job of getting Fugo's point of view across over the events of the text. So yeah, this is it. This is the end of Purple Haze feedback. I really hope you guys enjoyed my work. I really hope you guys enjoyed the text itself. And as Jimi himself will say very shortly, I hope you guys have a fantastic new year. Take care, guys. Afterword, on courage and feelings with no outlet. The real-life mafia head Lucky Luciano, you may have seen him in a movie or two, worked with the American army in the Second World War, and when they landed on Sicily, he made contact with the local mafia heads and convinced them to help. When the Allied forces freed Sicily from Nazi occupation, The Mafia were working behind the scenes to make it happen. This is a historical fact. Luciano was in prison at the time, but was freed as a reward for his cooperation. Compared to the overwhelming importance of the war, his crimes were of little significance. But this turn of events led directly to the power of organized crime in post-war Italy, and the narcotics they sold claimed innumerable victims. People often say that a little evil is justified by the greater good, but for those affected by that evil, the good no longer matters. That greater good becomes evil, as far as the victims are concerned, and resisting it only leads for further bloodshed. The problem is no longer one of good and evil, but of accumulated grudges. To pose an ordinary example, imagine a friend picks a song for karaoke you had planned on singing, and did this repeatedly until you lost your temper and said something. And then all your other friends looked at you like you were crazy for getting pissed off over nothing. Things get awkward between you, and soon you find yourself hating all of them. Everyone there was having fun, so there's a certain amount of pressure to ignore minor problems. But for the person who's had their song stolen over and over, those problems are no longer minor, and that pressure becomes an active source of frustration. They are now too angry to care what's right or wrong. Everyone agrees that what the consensus holds to be right should be given priority over your personal views, and I would say as much to others. But if it were my views causing problems, I'd find it a lot harder to be level-headed. What are people to do when they find the entire world has suddenly turned against them? When what they believed to be right is rejected by everyone? Should they assume they've been mistaken and calmly join the consensus, or grit their teeth and follow their gut? Or fly into a further rage over finding themselves in this predicament at all, with no real outlet for their emotions? Obviously, everybody makes mistakes. There are plenty of times when you are simply wrong, and everybody else is correct. In these situations, you're the one who has to bend, but other times you find yourself stubbornly standing your ground. You long for the courage to admit your mistake, but it doesn't come. You're stuck, and you don't even know why, but you feel that giving into societal pressure would cause you to lose something important. You fight back, but even then, in the end, consensus prevails, and you're doomed to lose. Whatever it was that seemed so important vanishes, and looking back, you can't even remember what it was. People often regret choices they've made, but perhaps what they should really regret, the losses that matter most, are the ones so fleeting they're forgotten. The courage to admit a mistake and the courage to stay true to yourself. These are both courage, but it's impossible to be sure which is right. The circumstances of the choice matter, as does the nature of the conflict. What matters is not the satisfaction of having been courageous, but the ability to determine accurately what has been lost as a result. They say that sincere actions based on the truth will never fail, but our lives are led hand in hand with loss, and there are no things immune to failure. You simply have to know where you stand, a conclusion that resolves nothing. But perhaps that is the point of this question. It is, after all, an issue that an entire lifetime is too brief to resolve, although I do not possess the courage to admit that. There's a Japanese idiom that literally translates as dig the roots, dig the leaves. This expression is often used to describe persistence and thoroughness, but there are some who take issue with the wording. After all, you can dig to reach roots, but not leaves. I think this complaint can be easily resolved by going outside. There are fallen leaves buried everywhere. Turn up the ground in a forest and you'll turn up leaf after leaf that has yet to rot away into this earth. You can dig as many leaves as you need. The issue is resolved with a little rational action. This is a situation where you should probably just admit your mistake, I think. The end. Should I say anything about JoJo? It's too late now. Purple Haze feedback. Lost in distant memories, days with companions long gone, drunk on the honor of friendship, certain it would never end. Now, vanished like a dream, faded, no warmth remaining, covered in a silent, deadly haze.